I'm really, really proud and happy that I'm able to present my colleague, Mr. Al Simon, who is the outreach chairman of RAPP, and who's been a great, great inspiration for me and for many others. What struck me the most about the need to bring him here and to talk about release-aging people in prison was something about what you were saying, Marcia, about the breadth of the struggle. And the importance for me is the whole notion of reaching back or out into the men and the women who are behind the wall. I think a lot of us, for many years, many of us have been involved in struggles involving Mumia Abu-Jamal and Russell Shoatz and Abdul Majid, but I wanted to know more about that, and I think through release-aging people in prison, I've really come to know more, maybe just in a minute way, as you told me on Saturday when we were talking about coming to the meeting, that, something about the struggles that were going on in prison. And I thought a lot about Ann Lamb, who's been really active in Jericho, as many of you know, New York City, Jericho, and she had talked about the misconception that many people have that people are, quote, languishing behind bars, that they're just sitting there and doing nothing. And what release-aging prison people in prison has done for me is to make me realize how much, like what you told me on Saturday when we got together and our conversations at RAPP, how much, the tremendous amount of work that people are doing behind the wall. And it really, I think it needs to be brought forward. And I was, when we were talking, you mentioned how you were counseling people, you were teaching, you were sharing, mentoring people. You and Fareed, Mujahideen Fareed is the lead organizer of RAPP, and really an incredible guy. And well, you are, of course, you are too, needless to say. But I mean, I was amazed that you guys were working in prison together, and you called it parallel work. That I said to Al, I said, well, what's it like being out after all these years? Yet you haven't been out that long, and you're doing all this work, and it's like a sea change. And he said, you said to me, no, it's not. It's parallel work. It's exactly what Fareed and I were doing in a way in prison, working together to change things. You were working on the HIV AIDS project that became a statewide project to help people with AIDS. You were doing all kinds of work right in the prison there that I hadn't any idea was going on. And I think many people do not. And through release-aging people in prison, that's becoming more known. A lot of the people who are in the group were formerly incarcerated. And the whole idea, Lynn Stewart talking about everyone in prison is a political prisoner. I think we need to really think about that and put names on it and realize that. And I think getting into a movement like release-aging people in prison really does that. And what we talked about, the idea that so many people are unconsciously political in prison, and as they're in prison, they grow and become more conscious of the oppression and of the forces that got them in there. So all this incredible work that you were doing and Fareed was doing became illuminated for me and important, and I realized more what Len was talking about. And then, of course, I have to give a little history because I think it's important how I happened to get involved in RAPP. I went to a Malcolm X dinner a few years ago, and I bought this book, Our Forgotten Political Prisoners with Cases in New York State. And a couple of years after that, I was looking at it, and I noticed somebody called Mohammed Koti. And he was a man who became, I think, even more political when he was in prison. And I realized, I wanted to reach out and know more about him, to put more of a name on just people that were there. And so anyhow, I think, and then I found out that actually through Koti, I got to know Fareed, the head organizer at RAPP. And somehow it just sort of, after a while, I decided, well, I've got to join RAPP, not only to help Coty, but to help all the other people, many of them nameless, kind of forgotten, as this title says. Unfortunately, this is out of print, but it really has extremely important information. So I just think that, it's of course, our warriors, our freedom fighters, certainly the man that we're going to feature tonight, Abdul Majid, who is coming up for parole after being in prison 33 years, and this is his first time to come up. I'm hoping everybody here is going to write another letter, or an original letter, if you haven't already. And we're going to see his mom, Mrs. Laborde, 93-year-old mother. When the film was done by RAPP, she was only 90. She's now 93 and still fighting. I mean, this is just incredibly important work, I think. So, again, getting back to what Lynn Stewart said, I think it behooves all of us to really get to know this struggle more. And to me, it links up so much. I mean, this is the most vulnerable people, the ones over 50. We go with over 50, which seems pretty young, but he's going to talk about the recidivism rate, and it goes steadily down the older you get. And here these, our political prisoners are all over 50. So I think we've got to make that link. We've got to do the work. So it's with great pleasure, and I'm really honored to be here and in this capacity to be able to introduce my friend, colleague, freedom fighter, Mr. Al Simon.
I'd like to thank you all for giving me the honor to come in here and do this presentation. I really appreciate that. RAPP really appreciate that, because what we do in my job as the outreach coordinator is to educate the population in relationship to what's taking place behind the wall and what the problem is in relationship to the individuals being stuck behind the wall for a long period of time. So before I go into that, what I like to do is everything starts with a history. So I like to give a brief history, because as we know, or we should know, and I'm quite sure you all know, that America is the leading country in the world as far as mass incarceration. They got 2-point-some-odd million people locked up behind the wall. They lead Russia, China, South Africa, so therefore now what happened is that they starting to see that that's just an embarrassment to them. They like a small percentage of the world population, but yet they incarcerated most of the population in the world. And so now what they're saying is that what we need to do is we need to rectify that situation. So now how did that happen? So if we look at back in the 70s, right, what happened was that they had an outcry, get tough on crime. And so when they was hollering, getting tough on crime, lock them up and throw away the key, they came up with different aspects on how we going to do that. So one thing that they came up with was minimum sentencing. And so therefore when you went to court, you had to get a certain sentence because it was mandated by law that you had to have a minimum sentence in order to go in. Most of them were like 10 years, 15 or 25 to life in relationship to drug-related cases. And so therefore, in relationship to that, and then moving in our fast future, they realized that they made a mistake in New York dealing with the Rockefeller law, and then they revised that Rockefeller law and they started letting those particular individuals out. And then another aspect that they dealt with, which was called the 3 strikes situation. And that means that if you had 3 felonies, you received a life sentence. And so therefore, it means that if you got 3 felonies on your record, when you go in front of the court, you get found guilty for the 3rd felony, you're going to receive a life sentence, whether 7 to life, 15 to life, 25 to life, or whatever. And so based on the felony that you receive, that would be the minimum sentence. And so a deep felony would be 7 to life, or that's the minimum they can give you, but most of the time they gave 15 or 20 to life in relationship to that. And then when we move a little further, we get what they call the Truth in Sentencing Act. And the Truth in Sentencing Act was the federal system indicating across the state, stating that in order for you to receive federal funds, right, you have to enact the Truth in Sentencing Act. And so therefore, dealing with the Truth in Sentencing Act, because one of the things they was talking about was doing away with the parole system. And so the Truth in Sentencing Act basically did away with the parole system in some aspects. And so now when the individual went into the Truth in Sentencing Act, that means that you got astronomical time, maybe 20 years, 30 years, and 40 years, and that's how it was. Prior to that, you had an indeterminate, which was 15 to life, 20 to life, 25 to life. So now you got a straight bid, and you had to do 85% of that before you was thinking about being released. So you can imagine what 85% of 30 years is, 85% of 40 years is. And so this is what the Truth in Sentencing Act, in order to receive the federal money to, deal with that situation. And the governor at that particular time that passed the Truth in Sentencing Act was Pataki, And so now what happens was that in the 70s, they had like maybe 23 New York State prisons. And so now what was happening is that they saying, okay, so we're gonna get tough on crime, therefore we have to have more prisons. And so from 70, they went from 23 to 72 prisons. And that was under the governor, Como. And so Como built all these prisons in that situation. So now, if we're gonna build prisons, then we have to have people that go in there and house those particular prisons. In other words, if you got a product, then you have to have consumers in order to do that. And so therefore, if you look at the prison population consists of black and brown individuals. And so now what happens is that they have what they call 7 neighborhoods where these individuals come from. And so therefore these 7 neighborhoods was actually being targeted. Targeted what? Targeted for the prison system. And so therefore, and this is how that overswelling of the prison population became up into, what, 70,000, 76,000. And so therefore you had that large concentration of the prison population. And now what happens is that those individuals, as we realize that individuals always make mistakes, and especially youth. When you're young, you do reckless things because you don't look at the consequences. And so therefore you figure everything is okay, everything is safe. And so now what happens is that they go out and they commit a serious crime, and they wind up receiving life sentences, 15 to life, 20 to life, 25 to life. And so now what that says is that the court says that this is your punishment. We're giving you 15 to life for what the crime that you committed, 20 to life for the crime that you committed, 25 to life for the crime that you committed. And so therefore, the court is saying that that's the punishment element. After you serve this 15, after you serve this 20, after you serve this 25, right? Based upon the behavior that you conduct, how you conduct yourself while you're incarcerated, your possibility of being released is eligible because you went beyond the punishment. And so now what we're doing is we're saying that the parole system, right, the parole commissioners, you have 14 parole commissioners in place at this particular moment, and they are appointed by the governor. And so therefore the parole commissioners reflect the attitudes of the people that appointed them. And so now when they say get tough on crime and throw away the key, right? And so therefore now they're saying, okay, and this is the analogy I like to use in relationship to that. They say, okay, we're going to put them in jail for this long period of time, and we're going to throw away the key. But in reality, we can't really throw the key away. So what are we going to do with the key? So they say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to turn it over to the parole commission. So they turn it over to the parole commissioners. They say, here's the key. So the parole commissioner get the key, and then they say, okay, what we're going to do is we build a case. So we build like a glass case, and we stick the key inside the case, and then we put a sign over the case. In case of emergency, break and use the key, right? But what happens is that the parole commissioners develop a blind spot in relationship to the key. As far as they're concerned, the key don't exist. And so now what happens is that when the individual come before them in relationship to the interview after serving the minimum amount of time that they had, the parole commissioner do not view the individuals for the changes that they made while they was inside of prison. And so now what I'd like to do is talk about some of the changes that the individual went through while they was incarcerated. So now, when they first come in, and you come in with a long sentence, and to indicate at this particular point, I served 30 years, right? And I just been out for about maybe 27 months, right? And so now what happens is that when you come into the system, first thing you say is, wow, 25 to life. What am I going to do? Right? How am I going to conduct myself? How am I going to handle this particular time? And so therefore, if you're not talking about killing yourself, if you're not talking about medicating yourself, then there's something that you have to do in relationship to how you're going to construct yourself while you're in prison. And so you say, okay, what I've been doing wasn't working because of my attitude, my thinking. So therefore, I have to change my thinking. So how would I change my thinking? So at this particular time when I went into the system, I just had a GED. So I said, well, what I need to do is I need to educate. Right? Now, I didn't really start out educating myself from the beginning, right, because they had college programs at this particular point. And so I knew individuals that was going to college, right, and then what I was doing, I was helping them with their work. And so when I was helping them with their work, they was receiving B's, B pluses, and so they was like, yo, why don't you go to college? You college material. And I was like, you know, come on, you know, because at that particular time, I didn't see no future, right? And so I was like, nah. And then I said, okay, let me go to college, you know, and let me see what it's about. So when I went to college, my mind started opening up. I started getting a different perspective. I started viewing the world from a different view based upon the teachers that I was interacting with. And let me tell you, I stayed on the honor list, right? And I graduated with an AA degree at 3.8 GPS, right? And so, you know, and dealing with that. And so now, at this particular time, it was a known fact that individuals that came home from prison that had a college education, the recidivism rate was basically nil, right? Because education, they come out and they don't know how to conduct themselves within society and move forward. And so now, the same person that did the Truth in Sentencing Act took the colleges out of prison. And so therefore now there's no colleges inside prison. And this is why the AA didn't go to a BA, because that process ceased, you know. And so, but now at the particular time, you have other programs inside the facility. And so now you got these other programs, and then she mentioned HIV and AIDS, and then in this particular time, I went into prison in '82. And so therefore, we know in the early '80s, when it came around with HIV and AIDS, nobody knew what was going on. And they had different names for it. And they wasn't even calling it HIV. You know, they wasn't even calling it AIDS. They was calling it GRID. You know, gay man-related syndrome. And so therefore, it was only related to that. And then they realized that it went beyond that, and then they started relating it to the Haitians, and then they realized that mothers was having babies that was positive, and so therefore now the whole concept changed. And so now they started AIDS-related immune syndrome, and that's where that came from. And so therefore now what was happening is that if you had the outside community, right, didn't understand what was happening and what was taking place with HIV and AIDS, can you imagine what was taking place in prison? Right? And so therefore the individuals that was living in prison that was affected, that really didn't know what was wrong with them, and the individuals kind of sensed something was wrong with them, they started isolating themselves from them. Some of them started burning them out. It meaning that if you live next to me, I'm going to set your cell on fire so you can be moved away. You ain't in the cell, but you're going, but as long as your cell's on fire, you can't come back and live there, they're going to put you someplace else. And so that's what the procedure that the inmates was taking. And so now what was happening is that we said they need to be educated in relationships to that. We knew individuals that was infected, and so therefore we came up with a program called PACE, Prisoners for AIDS Counseling and Education, right? And so now what was happening with that, we became the best education facility on the male process dealing with HIV and AIDS. But now our counterpart, which is Bedford Hills, which was the females, right? And so they call themselves AIDS, AIDS Counseling and Education. And so to chord that link, we just added the P, right? And so therefore that became PACE, right? And so we stayed in conjunction with each other, dealing with the same issues, right? And so that was one of the ways that we deal with HIV and AIDS and enlighten the population. What was that? And then the attitudes started changing in relationship to the individual that was infected, because they realized now that they can cause more harm to the individual that was infected than the individual that was infected can cause to them, because their immune system was so low that they can catch a cold, and once they catch a cold with the opportunities of infections, that they were subject to die. So then when they started realizing that, then they became more apathetic in relationship to what was taking place with the individuals. And then individuals that was in the hospital, we had a hospital visitation, we went up and started talking to them from that area. And so that was one of the projects that me and Fareed, the lead coordinator for RAPP, worked on at that particular time. This is one of the things that we brought together and organized. And then in prison, there's separation because you go from one place to another. And then what the system does, as you probably already know, because it only works, don't work necessarily in prison, it works out here as well. If we got a problem, what we do with the problem? We get rid of it. We move it over here, we move it over here, we transfer it, or we hide it, and don't deal with it. And so therefore, one of the things that Pataki never acknowledged, AIDS, because if they acknowledge the practice of AIDS, then you get funds to it. So they didn't really acknowledge it from that perspective. And so therefore, that was one of the things that we dealt with. So now what was happening, we're saying, okay, that deals with the health issue. So now what happened is how we're going to deal with the mental attitudes of the individuals that's coming in. Everybody that come in, don't have life sentences. They're going back out. So now what's happening is that we don't want you coming back into prison because you don't want, because when you go out and you come back in, you're going to be stuck in prison with a life bid. So you need to change your lifestyle. And so therefore what we started doing is we started educating and teaching these individuals how to change their lifestyle. Stop looking at things from a negative perspective and start looking at things from a positive perspective and start becoming proactive, getting away from the criminal lifestyle that you was living. Because what happens is that if you live in a criminal lifestyle, the road that you're traveling is very short. And there's only 3 outcomes. You either go to prison, you go to the mental institution, or you're going to death. And so therefore that road is real short. So we're telling them that you're living a short path. What you need to do is you need to reach down inside, understand who you really are, what your true potentials are, start looking at that and be the person that you really want to be without the influence of peer pressure. And so it's okay for you to be who you really want to be. Get your education, understand what the education is about, and then this way you can become the true person that really resides within inside you. And so the individuals, they look at that, they start understanding that. And so now what happens is that when you come out, you're going down a long path. So that path is indefinite, because now it's prosperity, you can go and be whatever you want. So a lot of these individuals that came home, they ran these particular programs, got good jobs, became taxpaying citizens, and they never recidivated. And so therefore that shows that what we was doing was actually working. And so now what was happening is that these individuals, they create these programs, they facilitate these programs, and they run these programs. And so now what happens is that after serving this lengthy time, and like I say, there's no light at the end of the tunnel, and what happens is that you have to just forget about time. You can't focus on 7 years, 8 years, or whatever. So you forget about it, and when you realize it, you're getting ready to go to the parole board. So now you're saying, wow, there is a little light here. The possibility of me coming home can be there. And so now when you go to the parole board, what the parole board, what they does, and when they have that hearing, right, what they look at when you go in front of them, they don't look at that transition that you did within that 20 years, 15 years, or 25 years. They look at the instant offense that brought you inside the system. And the instant offense ain't gonna never change. You can't change history. So that ain't gonna never change. That's gonna always remain the same, right? And so therefore, what they do, based upon the political situation or their own feeling in relationship to the charge, that they deny you parole. And once they deny you parole, they sentence you to 2 more years, because you have to wait 2 years before you go back to the parole board. And so now our lead coordinator, which is Majid, right, he had 15 to life. When he came home, he had served 33 years. 33 years. And so that means that the parole board resentenced him with more than what the courts did. They gave him 18 years. The court only gave him 15. And they sentenced him to 18 years, right? And so this is how they view the situation. And now, to show you the type of individual he was, you see the program that he created when he came home, right? And helping other individuals that stuck behind the wall and challenging the parole situation because the parole is broke. Tell them to break that glass and use that key, right? And so therefore, this is the things that we was doing while we were in there. Now, we are not exceptions. You got a lot of individuals within inside the prison systems that are actually doing the same thing, right? And they've been locked up for a long period of time. And to show you another example, and this is a fortunate thing for us, we have another individual that's coming home in a couple of more weeks, but he's been locked up ever since '72. Right? And they just released him, And so therefore, they're saying, whatever their particular reason for letting him go. But now he's up in his 70s, and so they're saying, okay, but now, like I said, with the education that you go through, and a lot of these individuals got college degrees, master's degrees, and some of them got 2 or 3 college degrees, you know? And so therefore, they saying, okay, we're gonna let them go. And I realized that 2 things. Age, you age out of crime. Because once you get older, you can't do the things that you were doing when you was young, you know? And so therefore, you age out of crime, and we have statistics and news articles and everything that state that individuals do age out of crime. And then at the same time, the education and the individuals with the mindset, and they change their perspective, and then that takes them out of the particular crime area. And so now what we're talking about in that area is we're talking about the political process. And so therefore now we know when we're talking about these 7 neighborhoods that are targeted, which for the black and browns that come to the prison structure, we have these individuals that was politically active while they was in the community. And so being politically active while they in the community, right, you have these individuals, they still within inside, and some of them been in there since the 70s, right? Some of them been there in the 60s, right? And they still inside, and then they are doing positive things in that relation, but at the same time, because they are political prisoners, that they are looking at it and viewed from that perspective, and this is how they dealing with them from that area. And so therefore what we were saying is that, okay, these individuals, right, deserve, right, as well as anything else, to be released, you know, because you can't, you know, hold them inside prison forever. And so therefore we deal with a 3-pronged situation. We deal with parole, we deal with compassionate release, we deal with compassionate release, and then we deal with clemency, right? And so these are the 3 elements that we deal with in relationship to trying to get the individuals, you know, out of the system, you know. And so therefore now what's happening is that these individuals politically active, and when they came into the system, and then Anita alluded to, the individuals inside become political active while they're in prison. Because now what's happening, because of the education, and now they realize that, okay, coming from the particular communities from which they came from, and they realized that the systematic oppression that took place, and so therefore, even though it looked like they was into crime and the peer pressure, but sometimes they was forced to go in that particular route because certain doors wasn't allowed to open to them. And so therefore, now they realize, oh, and so therefore, I was manipulated and coming into the prison structure. And so now what happens is they become conscious of that. And so why are they becoming conscious of that? And so therefore not to be for a victim of the manipulation. And this is how they say, okay, so let me come out and be a conscious individual and help other individuals to keep them from coming back into the prison system. And this is where what we have is called pre-incarceration. So therefore, to preventive aspects. So we'll come back out and teach the youth to get on a different path, because you're going to a path that's destructive, and that you need to be on a different path that's going to lead you to a better future. And so we're giving up our examples of what we went through, and so therefore we call that the alternative to incarceration. So a lot of them have these programs set up that deal with the youth in relationship to alternative incarceration, and that's how they become active in that particular area. Okay, so, all right, so now my time is just about up.
High-hanging fruit.
Okay, so before I end up, let me say that in relationship to the political structure with the mass incarceration, and so they realized that they would have to release individuals from prison in order to decarcerate the prison structure. And so now they're saying that what we need to do is deal with the low-hanging fruit, nonviolent individuals.
Like Obama.
And so therefore, if we're talking about letting go the nonviolent individuals, if you let all the nonviolent individuals out of prison, that will not decrease the prison population. So you would have to deal with the violent individuals, which is the high-hanging fruit. And so the high-hanging fruit. So now what happens is this. Let me give you a little clarity in relationship to what's called violence. Sometimes a violent crime is not always a violent crime in relationship to the individual, because what happens is that they with their peers. And so before 5 of them, and they run in a group and they got the masses on. So they are not being their true self. They just reflecting with the crowd, and we want to prove that I can be with you and I can be with you. But you always got that one individual, that wants to outshine us, do that. And so this individual might commit the murder, but because the rest of them was there, all 5 of them get convicted for that murder. And so therefore, you only have one individual that was actually really violent, but the rest of them were not violent. But yet still, they still get that violent situation because they have that A1 felony, and it says a violent crime. And so therefore, I'd like to end on that particular note. So I guess we open for questions. RAPP is basically an advocate group, and we advocate for the release of the elderly individuals inside the prison. And in the process of advocating for that, what we do is we educate the community about those individuals that are constantly being denied by the broken system, which is the Parole Commission and the Parole Board, based upon the changes that they made while they're still in prison. But at the same time, they're constantly being denied when they go for the interview. And so what we're doing in relationship to the petition, and if you read the petition, it says to release elderly in prison. And so statistics show that the elderly, or once they're released, are the least to recidivate when they come home. The recidivating rate is like 5%. And surprisingly, the individuals that's incarcerated for murder, and once they come home, the recidivism rate is 0, right? They do not go back to prison. And so now what happens is that these individuals, when they come home, after being incarcerated for a long period of time and having a different mindset, that the prison structure and going back to prison is no longer part of their concept. And so somewhat in relationship to what you was asked about what happens to these individuals when you come home, and some of these individuals when they come home, as opposed to going back to prison, they'd rather be homeless in the street, right? Or living in shelter, as opposed to going back into those subjugated harsh conditions, right? And now she mentioned 50 as being a young age in relationship for the elderly, but what happens is that statistics show that individuals in prison age 15 years faster than the individuals within inside society, because you got poor health, you got poor nutrition, and you got stress. You got overwhelmingly stress, and so therefore that increases the age. So this is why they went to the age of 50 as far as in relationship to the elderly in prison. And so our responsibility is to get the community to acknowledge that these individuals, and that's why our slogan says, if the risk is low, let them go. Now, the parole have what they call the evaluation system, which is a compass. And so once you take that evaluation system, if you score low on that, that indicates that the possibility of you coming back to prison is very low. And the elderly, when they score on that, they score very low. But the parole commissioners discount that. They don't even pay that any attention. All the changes that show that these individuals are no longer a threat to society upon being released or discounted or denied by the parole system for whatever particular reason they want, and they can continue to hit these individuals. And you heard what she said in relationship to her son. And that's why we say we would deal with the compassionate release, because a lot of these individuals, what happens now is they become incapacitated, and some of them are terminally ill. And so we said, let them come home as opposed, and die with dignity as opposed to dying with inside the prison system. And so now in relationship to that, when the individual come home, what happens to them, right? And so now you got those individuals that, like I said before, that didn't have life sentences, but had lengthy sentences. And when they came home, they worked for the particular agencies, like Osborne Association, Fortune Society, and other particular agencies. And these are formerly incarcerated individuals that have positions there. And what they do is they help individuals when they come home to seek employment, right, seek housing, and to get benefits or entitlements from that particular area. Because a lot of them didn't have no work history, so they set them up with SSI, and Medicaid or Medicare, and then in that situation. Because in the prison system, all they do is give you $40, which is your own money, that they put away on the side, and two, they what they call lag pay. They take, you only make, when I was there, I was only making $15 every 2 weeks, right? And so now what happens is that some people make $6 every 2 weeks, and they take that money out until you get $40, and then they put that on the side and you can't spend that, and that's your release money. And they give you that, you come home, and then that's it. You have nothing else. And if you don't have these people out there to willing to assist you and aid you, you're basically on your own. And particularly if you don't have a family. Right now, you see that that's Abdullah's mother, and she's aging. Now he's still in prison. Now what happens if she happened to pass before he come home? You know, and some people don't have a family when they are fortunate enough to have a family. And so this is the situation here. So what we doing is we challenging the legislators, we challenging Governor Como, and we challenge the Parole Commission to change that particular attitude they had, take a humanistic attitude and view the individuals for who they are today and not based upon a record that is 30, 40, or so many years old. And so this is what we're looking at. This is why we have the petition. And the petition says, the community says, we're willing to accept these individuals back into the community and give them the chance to have dignity and become different individuals and help our society from that perspective. And this is our challenge in relationship to that. You can't get a civil service job because they pass a lot of rules now. If it doesn't require, like, you ain't gonna work as a police officer or not, but you can work in a post office, you can do sanitation and things of that nature. Now what happens is that these organizations, individuals that know you can't go back to the projects or public housing, even though that's where you was living when you came out. So therefore they fought to have that rule changed. And now what they have is they have what they call a policy now, which is a pilot project that the individual been home for a long period of time and showing that the individual is no longer on that destructive path, that they can live in private housing at this particular moment. So that's a pilot project that they got going now. So all these little things that they have in place, these individuals that gain the knowledge while they're in prison, knowing how they can change the system once they come back out, right? Because like you say, oppression is oppression no matter where you're at. And like you say, slavery is slavery no matter, your plantation is a plantation. And then that free labor. And then you got industries that go inside the prison structure, and you got them working for nothing. And so therefore, and that's the system, you know? And so the prison structure, and it creates jobs. You know, and so therefore this is what's happening in that area. So this is the challenge and this is the fight that we have. But what we're saying that these individuals that deserve to be released, you know, let these individuals out. Break that classification, right, and then be willing to, based upon the evaluation, and then what we get with coalitions, and when we get with coalitions, we go with their cause too. They got what they call a Safe Parole Act, and dealing with that Safe Parole Act, that deals with different guidelines in relationship to how the parole board can conduct themselves, right? Also, we went to a candlelight visual at Como House just a couple of weeks ago in relationship to clemency, you know, and so therefore now they're having something that's coming up on the 21st, the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, in relationship to, I think you got a post on the wall in relationship to something of that particular nature. With Cornell West and Dyson, right? And so, there you go, yeah, stop the mass incarceration. And they doing protesters, and they having something on 59th Street on the 24th. And we become parts of these particular groups that's dealing with that. And this is how we contribute in that area, because it's not just one group that's going to solve the problem. It takes a collective, right? Because now what we're talking, we're the grassroots, and it's the people that makes the changes, right? Because the more that the people struggle, the more the changes are going to come about, you know?